Welcome back, Pauls. Let's see if Nancy's finding a later will. Let's go straightly back to the chapter. It's chapter 18, A Suspenseful Search. When Nancy awoke the following morning, bright sunlight was streaming through her open bedroom window. As her eyes turned towards the clock on her dresser, she was alarmed to see that it was a little after 9 o'clock. How could I have overslept on a morning like this? She chided herself. Quickly running her hands under the pillow, she brought out the Crawley's notebook and surveyed it with satisfaction. What a surprise the Tophams are going to get, she murmured softly. After hastily bathing and dressing, Nancy hurried downstairs, looking very attractive in a blue summer sweater suit. She kissed Hannah Gren, who said a cheery good morning and told Nancy that Mr. Drew has already left for his office. Oh dear, Nancy said. I wonder if he has forgot our date. No, indeed, the housekeeper replied. He phoned Judge Hart and expects word from him by 10 o'clock. He'll let you know the result. My goodness, Nancy, you have really made a big discovery. I do hope everything turns out for the best. She went into the kitchen but returned in a moment with a plate of crisp golden waffles. Better eat your breakfast, she advised. Your dad may call any minute. Nancy ate a dish of strawberries, then started on the waffles. These are yummy, she stated, pouring maple syrup over a second one. She had just finished eating when the phone rang. Mr. Drew was calling to say Judge Hart had made arrangements at the bank. Come to my office with the notebook and the key, Nancy. We'll start from here. I'll be right down, Dad. Nancy went upstairs for her purse, then drove to her father's office. I have the notebook with me, she told the lawyer. Do you want it? We'll take the book along. I want to show it to the head of the trust department at the bank, Mr. Drew said. It's a proof we have good reason for taking a look in Mr. Crawley's box. After leaving a number of instructions with his private secretary, Carlson Drew followed his daughter from the office. He took his place beside her in the convertible. I'll never get over if we don't find a new bill, Nancy declared as they drove along. A flush of excitement had tinted her cheeks and her eyes were bright. You must remember one thing, Nancy, returned her father calmly. Crawley was an old person and did things in an odd way. A will may be there and again it may not. Perhaps he only left further directions of finding it. I remember one case in Canada years ago. An eccentric Frenchman died and left directions to look in a trunk of old clothes for a will. In the pocket of a coat were found further instructions to look in the closet of his home. Then his family found a note telling them to look into a copper boiler. The boiler has disappeared but finally located in a curiosity shop. Instead, pasted on the bottom was what proved to a word puzzle in Chinese. The old Frenchman's heirs were about to give up in desire when a Chinese solved the puzzle and the old man's fortune was found, a bag of gold under a board in his bedroom floor. At least they found it, said Nancy. The trip to Mansoville was quickly accomplished and Nancy parked the car in front of Merchants Trust Company. Father and daughter alighted and entered the bank. Mr. Drew gave his name and asked to see the president. After a few minutes' wait, they were ushered into a private conference room. An elderly man, Mr. Jensen, arose to greet them. The introductions over, Mr. Drew hastened to state his mission. Before he could finish the story, the bank president broke in. Judge Hart has told me the story. I'll call Mr. Warren, our trust officer. He picked up his desk phone and in a few minutes Mr. Warren appeared and was introduced. Nancy now brought out the notebook, opened it to the important page and handed it to the men to read. When they finished, Mr. Jensen said, What a mystery. Mr. Warren pulled from his pocket the file card which the owner of the box 148 has filled out in the name of Josiah Johnston. The two samples of the crumpled handwriting were compared. I would say, Mr. Drew spoke up, that there is no doubt about the Crawley and Johnston were the same person. I agree, asserted Mr. Jensen, and his trust officer nodded. Then there is no reason why we shouldn't open the box, Mr. Drew asked. None, Mr. Warren replied. Of course, nothing may be removed, you understand. All I want to see, Nancy spoke up, is whether there is a will in the box, the date on it, who the executor is, and who the heirs are. The banker smiled and Mr. Jensen said, You are hoping to solve 4 mysteries all at once? Well, let's get started. With Mr. Warren in the lead, the four walked towards the rear of the bank to the vault of the trust department. A guard opened the door and they went through. Mr. Jensen took the key from Mr. Crawley's notebook, while Mr. Warren opened the first part of the double safety lock with the bank key. Then he inserted the key from the notebook. It fitted. In a moment, he lifted out the deposit box number 148. It was a small one and not heavy, he said. We'll take it into a private room, Mr. Jensen stated. He, Nancy, and Mr. Drew followed the trust officers down the corridor of cubby-hole rooms until they reached one not in use. "Now," said Mr. Jensen, when the door was closed behind them, "we shall see how many, if any, of the mysteries are solved." Nancy held her breath as he raised the list of the box. All peered inside. The box was empty except for one bulky document in the bottom. "Oh, it must be the will," Nancy explained. "It is a will," Mr. Jensen announced after a hasty glance at the first page. Josiah Crawley's last will and testament. "When was it returned?" Nancy asked quickly. "In March of this year," Mr. Jensen told her. "Oh, Dad," Nancy cried. "This was later than the will the Topham submitted for probate." "That's right. Let's read it right away," Nancy begged. Mr. Jensen handed the sheets to Mr. Drew. "Maybe you can decipher this. The handwriting is too much for me." The lawyer took the will. Then, as Nancy looked over his shoulder, he hastily read aloud, giving an interpretation rather than a word-by-word account. "Mr. Jensen, Mr. Warren, your bank has been named as executor," he said. "Very good," the president smiled. "But I expect Mr. Topham won't be happy to hear this." Mr. Drew has turned to the last page. "The signature of Josiah is in order," he remarked, "and there are two witnesses, Dr. Nesbitt and Thompson Backey. No wonder this will didn't come to light. Both those men died in April." As Nancy tried to decipher the handwriting, she noticed to her delight that the Hoover girls and Abby Robin were mentioned. At this moment, the president said, "Mr. Drew, the bank's regular lawyer, has just left Europe on an extended vacation. Since you and your daughter have solved the mystery and are so vitally interested in it, would you handle this case for us?" Nancy's eyes sparkled and Mr. Drew smiled. "I would certainly be very glad to," he said. "What instructions have you for us?" Mr. Warren asked. Mr. Drew thought a moment, then said, "Because of the unusual aspect of this case, I believe that first of all I would like you to have photostats of the will made so I can study the contents carefully." "We'll be happy to do that," Mr. Jen replied. "And then, after I'm sure everything is legal," Mr. Drew went on, "I'll deliver the original will for the probate and notify the people who will benefit from Mr. Crawley's estate." "Fine," said Mr. Jensen. "We have photostating equipment right here. I'll have a couple of copies made while you wait. Or shall I send them to your office?" Mr. Drew glanced at his daughter. "We'll wait," he said smilingly. While the photostats were being made, Nancy's smile was raising. "Oh, I hope Allison receives enough money to pay for singing lessons and the other deserving people get nice amounts," she whispered to her father, who nodded. The wait seemed interminable to Nancy, who could not still sit. She walked back and forth until finally her father remarked teasingly, "You are like a caged lion." Nancy pretended to pout. "At least I'm not brawling," she said, and Mr. Drew grinned. Soon a messenger brought back the will, together with two photostates of the document. "Thank you," said Mr. Jensen, who handed the photostatic copies to Mr. Drew. "I'll work on this at once," the lawyer promised as he put the papers in his briefcase. Then he and his daughter left the bank. Mr. Drew insisted that he and Nancy stop for lunch and refused to let her look at the will while they were waiting to be served. "Relax, young lady," he warned. "There's no point in letting any prying eyes know our secret." As he saw his daughter's animating fading, Mr. Drew said, "Suppose you come to my office with me and we'll work on the problem together? I have the will typed. In this way, its full meaning can be understood more easily." "Oh, thanks, Dad," said Nancy. In the lawyer's office, the young sleuth sat down beside the typist, Mr. Lemme. As each page came from the machine, Nancy read avidly. "Mr. Crawley certainly seemed to know the correct phraseology for drawing up a will," she remarked. Finally, when the typing has been completed, Nancy said to the secretary, "I have a lot of questions to ask Dad." Miss Lambie smiled. "If they are legal ones, he'll know all the answers," she said. "There is no better lawyer in River Heights than your father." Nancy smiled as she dashed into her father's office. The true Drew sat down to study Josiah Crawley's last will and testament. "If this does prove to be legal," Nancy said, "it will certainly be a blow of the Tophams." "I'm afraid so." "Dad, when you call a meeting of all the relatives and read the will aloud," Nancy said, "please may I be there?" Mr. Drew laughed. "I'll humor you this time, Nancy. You may be present when the Tophams get the surprise of their lives." Oh, what a surprise for the Tophams. Stay tuned for the next chapter, guys. Have a happy day.